Before we move further into thinking about networks and, in fact, analyzing interactions, I want to spend a few minutes with you on the idea of complexity, and especially social complexity. It is a topic that I've always found fascinating. It is the topic, in fact, that decided me to go into research in that area about 12 years ago, and it's something that is fundamental, in fact, to understanding our world, and especially understanding our connected social world. Simply speaking, complexity is the study of how things that interact on a small level create patterns on a large level. And that requires us to think about systems. So system thinking, which is related to complexity, is the study of how things relate to each other. You will note that I talk about things, not people, because these things can be grains of sand, and we're getting to this, or can be sheep. And in fact, understanding how small-scale interactions create large-scale behaviors in a system is key to understanding things such as the stock market fluctuations produced by herding, people just following other people essentially blindly often, segregation, how neighborhoods are formed, wars, how conflict emerges between people or animals, but also how fashion emerges or how social norms are created. Essentially, it is a study of emergent phenomena. Emergence is how, again, often unintuitive, large-scale patterns emerge from small-scale interactions. And for this, I want to give you two of my favorite examples. What you see here is something you know, ants. Ants, as you might know, tend to follow pheromones, so essentially trails, chemical trails that are left by individuals to signal the presence of food. What you see here, though, is an aberrant behavior. This shouldn't happen. This is a rare case where an individual, an ant, formed a looping trail, and this led other ants to follow the same looping trail, and essentially here they're forming some sort of like a treadmill or a pinwheel, and they will, in case there isn't a stronger trail that is formed externally, they will follow this trail and loop until exhaustion and die. That's a bit of a sad example. So let's look at this one. Flocking, in fact, the study of flocking, how animals move together, animals and humans, including humans, of course, is a whole field in complexity science and in something called collective behavior. Flocking or herding is how groups of animals behave at scale. And what is very interesting in this video is that this herd of sheep behaves like a fluid. This is like liquid pouring out of a bottleneck or something. And the fact is, it is exactly that. Animal flocks, animal herds like this can be modeled as liquids. So there's a tight link between physics of fluids and the study of flocks and the study of groups in general, and this is complexity. And before we go into concrete examples, or in fact interactive examples, I want to tell you a few more things. In fact, one of the things that got me so interested in this topic was the formation of patterns on seashells, and the fact that in fact these were related to epidemics, and there was a very similar dynamics at play for these to appear. You see here a seashell, and what you can see is that the patterns on the shell are very irregular. In fact, they're strangely interesting, and I always found this fascinating. They are formed by a mechanism called activation inhibition, the release of a given pigment that is reinforced by itself and essentially disables itself and it starts again. And this is as the shell is formed. And understanding this, in fact, also allows us to understand things like epidemics. If you think about this, the propagation of a disease through a contact is very much the same. So the density of disease, or the density of, if we're studying trends, information about a particular topic increases locally and is released in the population and then decreases. And by understanding seashells, you get to understand fashion. Another example, what is called excitable medium or excitable media and propagation through this. This allows us to understand sand dunes, how sand dunes are formed, but also Mexican waves in a stadium. The way a sand dune is formed is simply with grains of sand being carried by the wind and essentially accumulating at a given point in space. And because the sand is being accumulated, it will also slow down while being carried. A wave will be created. It's a static wave, it's a dune. And because of that, there's a minimum distance at which another dune can be formed. And that's why you can see, like here in sand, you see this very irregular pattern of sand dunes appearing. It is the exact same thing for a Mexican wave, like here. You've seen in a stadium people essentially realizing that there's a wave coming and then rising all at the same time, and how this gives rise to a circular wave. Well, it's the same thing. This can be modeled in the same way by considering the crowd as an excitable medium, and considering that people are triggered by other people the same way that grains of sand are triggered by wind. And considering this, you can explain both sand dunes and Mexican waves. Beyond this, in fact, you can explain traffic jams. I've included a video that shows how the stop-and-go motion of cars in dense traffic can be explained simply by the reaction of drivers to one driver braking. I encourage you to click on the first link in this slide and simulate it by yourself. So what you'll see is that the simulation starts with cars essentially rotating around a loop. And the only rule that is simulated is that drivers accelerate when there's free space in front of them and brake when there's less free space, so when the car in front of them brakes. And if the traffic is dense enough, one car braking at a given point in time will be enough to propagate a congestion in traffic and have it propagate backwards. And that's exactly what you can see in the simulation. And this will create this stop-and-go motion that you're very familiar with in traffic. These are things that we discovered back in the 90s by really taking concepts from physics, the physics of particles, how particles move, and applying them to social systems like drivers, for example, or stadiums. That's why I find social systems, complex social systems, so interesting. They are inherently complex and they show emergent properties. So understanding the behavior of systems at a global scale requires understanding fine-grained interactions between individuals. And this, in fact, is why we study networks, why we study interactions, and why we describe them as networks. And what I want to do now is I want to walk you through a simple simulation of a complex system, which will introduce essentially, which will pave the way to a deeper understanding of how individuals react to one another and how to simulate this. To better understand the principles behind emergence and complexity, and what this has to do with simulation, and what this has to do with social systems, I decided to show you a really cool example of essentially a bit of a game written by Nicky Case, an American designer, in which we understand how local rules create global patterns in a forest. And this forest happens to be drawn with emojis, but in fact it can be anything. It doesn't have to be a forest, it can be a social system, and we'll see this in a bit. What you see here is a forest, again, simulated as a 10 by 10 grid, and each of the cells can be populated by a tree or not. Trees appear randomly in an empty spot with a 0.1% chance. So every empty spot at any time step can turn into a tree. And sometimes there's a fire. In this case, I'm going to add the fire. What just happened was that the fire propagated to every neighboring tree. So if the density of trees is high enough, then the fire will destroy the entire forest. Let's look at this now. If I'm clicking here, if I add fire manually, but the density is not very high, the forest is protected. So essentially, this tiny forest is protected by its small size. Now, what happens if we make the system a bit more interesting? Now, well, the forest is slightly larger, and at every point in time, with a 0.3% chance, an empty cell turns into a tree. However, there's also lightning in that forest. So with a 0.01% chance, at any point in time, an empty cell turns into fire. If the fire appears at a cell that has a neighboring tree, it propagates until it can't find trees anymore and it simply dies out. What do we see? What is happening in this forest? As I'm sure you've realized, there are small fires and there are big fires. And in fact, the distribution of the size of these fires is actually called a power law. We'll learn about power laws later in the course. It's a distribution that captures the idea that there's many small fires and a few large fires, like earthquakes, for example, where lots of small earthquakes happen, but very rarely a very large earthquake happens and is devastating. What we see here is that as the density of trees grow, essentially the density of the forest grows, but this also increases the chance that fire catches on and destroys more of the forest. So more trees, the fire can spread further, which leads to fewer trees. But then if there are fewer trees, the fire spreads less and the trees can grow back. And what we see is an alternating dynamics of a lot of trees and then fewer trees and a lot of trees, etc. And this pattern is an emergent property of the system. So this is thinking in systems. We think about local interactions, but to really understand the dynamics of the forest, to really understand the patchiness of a forest and the importance of forest fires, we need to think about the whole system. Let's make this even a bit more interesting. So in this case, I have the same system with the same rules, except that now I can add borders that kill trees, borders that keep trees from growing next to them. And in fact, you can probably think or see where I'm going with this. You've seen forests and you've seen how forests are protected. Counterintuitively, in fact, forests are protected by destroying forests, by cutting empty, clean areas of land where no trees are allowed to grow. And what you see here is that this border, the fact that we are keeping an area clean of trees, creates fire breaks and keeps the fires from spreading outside of the enclosure to inside and inside to the outside, and essentially contains the fires so that they can only propagate through a small area. In the link that is in the notes, you can actually play with these systems. You can play with these systems. You can understand the dynamics, the role of the parameter governing tree growth. You can play by adding lightning. You can make, very easily in a browser, you can make your own fire breaks, etc. And beyond this, I'm not going to go into this right now, but you can play with different species of trees that are resistant to fire and trees that choke, or plants that choke other trees, which is actually quite representative of real systems. And this, little by little, adding parameters and playing essentially with the parameters will lead you to understand how trees, how forests are patchy. So how there are some patches with a lot of large trees and then patches with grass. And it's essentially very similar to what we see in nature. It is a simplistic but realistic depiction of how a forest grows. Now you'll say, okay, all good. I mean, we learn about emergence, we learn about self-organization, how a system self-organizes, but we didn't really learn about how social systems work. Well, actually you did. This simulation, this canvas, is super useful because I encourage you, and actually we could do this together in a lecture next time. I encourage you to play with the rules. Instead of having trees and fire, you can have blue people and red people, you can have happy people and unhappy people. And you can understand, at least from a high level, because we'll get into these topics later, you can understand the dynamics of epidemics, so how diseases spread in a population, but also how, with the rodents this time, with the mice and rabbits, how segregation happens, how you end up with neighborhoods with a given ethnic group, even though there's no understanding at a global scale of why these neighborhoods form, and people don't decide actively to live in a given neighborhood, but they just based on their local preferences, they tend to associate with people more like them, and this creates segregation. And you also learn about the emergence of wars, so large-scale conflict in populations. I encourage you to play. In fact, I've played with this for at least an hour. I encourage you to play with the system and have fun and get an understanding of how small-scale interactions, how things that happen in these cells, in this simplified representation of life, how this creates big things, be it forest fires or epidemics or wars.